We'll talk about China and its role regarding Ukraine a little bit. We'll get into Taiwan, the Dalai Lama, and, the Taiwan separatism, Tibetan separatism, and then we'll finish it off talking about the BBC complaining about being labeled as state media when they absolutely 100% are state media. So let's take a look at this first article. Let me make sure I'm doing this right. This is from ABC Australia, state media. Ukrainian troops withdraw from some areas amid unrelenting Russian attacks on Bakhmut. And we've been talking about this constantly. And we said that this was what was going to happen. It's a heavily fortified city. The fact that Ukraine gave up any ground at all in this heavily fortified city shows that they're stretched. Their combat capacity is waning. And now even this, because they're citing British intelligence, that intelligence update that they give, I don't know if it's daily or not, but they've said quite ridiculous things. The fact that they're saying something reasonable actually kind of worries me. Let's start with Danny and then Angelo. What do you think about this? The Western media, Western governments starting to publicly talk about how bleak things are becoming in Ukraine. Oh, Danny, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, no, it comes in the midst of these Pentagon leaks, and all of them kind of point in the same direction, that there is, whether it's redirection or distraction, there is an attempt to demonstrate maybe more of what people like yourselves and all of us have been saying, which is that Ukraine doesn't really have a chance here. But I think it's interesting, the timing of this, because how many weeks have we heard over and over and over again that Ukraine is going to launch some spring counteroffensive? And it appears that this admission, or these many admissions that are happening, are kind of laying the groundwork for possibly delaying this and delaying this and delaying this for as long as it takes until the collective West is able to muster up some kind of counteroffensive for Ukraine. But I do think the timing is interesting, because there's obviously a level of understanding. It's not just us talking about it. There's definitely an understanding within this war-making class, within the neocon establishment, that this situation, the situation with the war, is not going according to how I think the collective West hoped it would go, since, all the way back to last year. I think they hoped that it was going to be a much quicker conflict, and that was never going to be the case. And now the consequences of that are bearing some fruit.
Yeah. And Angelo, I mean, what are the chances that they're looking for an off-ramp, or they're just buying time, or what do you make of this? Why are they suddenly saying things that make sense after over a year of fabrications?
It's hard to say, but I would say probably they're starting to prepare the mind of people that actually it's not what they depicted for 1 year. So you see, the thing is that at some point they don't want overnight the collapse of Ukraine without starting to prepare people. So they need to come up a little bit slowly, gradually, with the truth. Because otherwise, let's say if overnight, they've been telling us that Ukraine was winning the war. And what if overnight Ukraine really collapses? Because there's a probability. We don't know that, but there's a probability. So they need to start preparing people, So they were doing 100% propaganda. Maybe they might start doing a 10% of real news within the 90% or 100% of propaganda.
Well, that's a good point. And what about the possibility that they want to escalate significantly, but first they need to kind of panic the public and say, "Oh no, everything is going bad for Ukraine. Look how bad everything is. So let's get involved even more so." Danny, what do you think about that?
I think it's definitely a possibility. I don't think that the collective West, especially the United States in its foreign policy establishment, has anything with the idea of pulling back. And I don't think that was ever the case for Ukraine, that ever would be the case for Ukraine. They're obviously in this for the long haul. For them, I think it's just a matter of how can they justify it, given that they're going to be pretty monumental and significant defeats and hiccups and just incredible issues with pushing through toward any kind of semblance of victory. I honestly believe the U.S. foreign policy establishment doesn't see victory in its sights. It's just hoping that it can escalate for long enough and keep this conflict going so that it can reap whatever benefits it can from it, including building up towards some kind of capability to confront Russia militarily. But I think that there's many in the foreign policy establishment who knows that's not a quick endeavor. That's not something that's going to be accomplished within, a short amount of time.
Yeah. And Angelo, what about you? Do you think there's a possibility that they're trying to create a window of opportunity to actually escalate this rather than, because I agree that they definitely have to start making that transition into reality so people aren't shocked. But is there a possibility they could also use this as an opportunity to escalate?
What kind of escalations? That's the question. They have depleted. The EU doesn't have any weapons to send. They don't have any more ammunition to send. So what is the escalation? What could it be? The next step is boots on the ground. But next step means, once we're talking about boots on the ground, we are talking about a formal war declaration. That's the next step. So who's willing to do that? Boots on the ground first. I would say probably the Baltic countries and Poland, but the rest of Europe is not going to follow. And we've seen you go with boots on the ground, but what you have to offer more than what Ukraine had. Keep in mind that Ukraine had the best army in Europe, probably after Turkey. So that army doesn't exist anymore. It's going to be exactly the same. Put 200, 300,000 troops coming from Poland. Well, it's going to be demilitarized, slowly grinding, because they don't have much more to offer. I would say that you can correct me here, but I would say that the next stage is probably since they have depleted the armed defense, things could go much, much faster, because once you have supremacy, air supremacy, then you can do really massive damage.
Yeah, it's a good point. Escalate with what? And the air defense systems are obvious, whether you believe, because this was mentioned in these leaks, these leaked documents that are out there. They talked about how Ukraine's air defense systems were depleted. But we also already saw this unfolding, because months ago they were talking about sending Western air defense systems to Ukraine. Why would they talk about that? It's not easy to send these. It's not easy to train Ukrainians on them. There's not a huge supply of interceptor missiles for any of these systems. So to take a step like that, the fact that Ukrainian air defenses were heavily depleted, it was obvious. And now I kind of am starting to think that maybe they're pushing Ukraine to do the offensive now, because just as you say, Angelo, once the air defense systems are out completely or to a greater degree, and the Russian Air Force is operating more freely over Ukraine, we heard this term game changer a lot. It actually will be a game changer. It'll be just like in Syria when Russia went in and began bombing the supply lines. Now, another point I want to make, and this is how I want to segue to this next topic, is they need to save the U.S. and their allies. They need to save their air power for a potential war with China. If they get involved heavily in Ukraine, they intervene themselves and they begin expending their air power there, the munitions used with their war plans. That is going to detract from any possible conflict with China. And so let's take a look at this from Al Jazeera. Here we have another European leader attempting to lecture China on how China should handle the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Call on aggressor Russia to end war. Germany urges China. And this is Annalena Baerbock, and she's doing this and apparently oblivious to the fact that China is well aware that they're next. Danny, what do you think about this?
Well, it's quite embarrassing because Olaf Scholz was in China late last year and spoke a very different tune. And of course, this comes on the heels of Emmanuel Macron's recent visit last week, where he essentially ignored the Taiwan question. And this has infuriated the collective West, especially the mainstream media, but especially the U.S. foreign policy establishment is incredibly angry with Macron for not asserting any kind of interest in the U.S.'s Taiwan project. And so Annalena Baerbock appears to be doing some damage control. Her statement in front of Qin Gang, the current Chinese foreign minister, was really embarrassing, because what she essentially committed to was following along with the U.S.'s strategy and saying that an alliance with the United States and not being sort of not playing any kind of middle ground or not taking a position on Taiwan is out of the question, and that Germany really needs to be concerned about China. In China, I mean, this is not diplomatic behavior. Pepe Escobar says it all the time. The U.S. never did diplomacy, and Germany is now just an extension of the United States and is also not doing diplomacy. And it's incredibly stupid in a lot of ways, because Germany is really reliant on China economically, and any kind of escalation with China on the part of Germany will only do more damage. But given what we've learned about Nord Stream and how subservient and absolutely servile Germany has been around that, this does not come as a surprise, especially since Baerbock is the same person who admitted that Germany is at war with Russia when it comes to this Ukraine conflict.
A lot of good points. And if it weren't for the Nord Stream pipelines being blown up, I would have thought for sure Europe was going to resist being dragged into the proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, and I would have for sure been certain that they would not be dragged into any sort of proxy conflict with China. But I agree with you. I don't think so. And you mentioned France and Macron, Angelo Macron. Do you think his trip to China and his comments about not being a vassal of the U.S., is this for real this time, or is this just him doing what he did all the way up until the proxy war against Russia started in Ukraine?
I would love to believe that what he says is right. Really, that could be a game changer. He's actually having the posture of a wannabe de Gaulle, and that could actually completely change the whole game. Because imagine a country which is still quite powerful, a nuclear superpower like France, taking a stance like more balanced stance when it comes to China, where you would have potentially other countries following France. But then I do not trust Macron. Macron is a pure product, globalist product. He's been telling the people, there's a saying in France, we say en même temps. When he came into power, he said, I'm not from the left, but I'm not from the right either. And he was all along like this, trying to please everybody and saying everything and the contrary. He could say the opposite the next day. So here, it is extremely surprising, yes, what he said so far. He kept on saying, when he came back to France, he kept on saying that. It's a big, big question mark. Then when it comes to Germany, I think Germany is more in. It's completely following the US. I don't have much hope. I would say there's probably two. We need to differentiate. There's Olaf Scholz and Baerbock. Baerbock, she's from the Green, extreme Atlantist. I would say Olaf Scholz might be a bit more moderate, but he doesn't have any choices, because to maintain the coalition he has, he needs to keep the Green with him.
Absolutely. And I honestly believe that France and Germany are going to disappoint us again. And what I thought was interesting is Baerbock's there lecturing China about sovereignty in Ukraine, while the United States is trampling China's sovereignty regarding Taiwan. And I've pointed this out a million times, and I'm going to point it out again before I even open the news story. This is the official U.S. State Department website, U.S. relations with Taiwan. And it says very clearly and unambiguously, it does not recognize Taiwan's independence. Right here, we do not support Taiwan independence. And they talk about a one China policy. And for people who don't know what that is, it means there's only one China. Taiwan is part of it. There's only one government ruling over all of China, including Taiwan. It's the People's Republic of China in Beijing. The US recognizes this. The UK recognizes this. The EU does. And every European country individually does. Australia does. every nation on earth just about recognizes this, and of course the UN does. And yet, what do we have? We have this. This is from Radio Free Asia. This is U.S. government media. U.S. House of Representatives introduces its own Taiwan bill, and they're talking about Michael McCall, who said that they'll put boots on the ground over Taiwan, fighting over Taiwan, which the U.S. officially recognizes as Chinese territory. Danny, why don't you start? And what do you think about, first of all, Germany lecturing China about national sovereignty while ignoring the U.S. and also Europe to a degree, trampling Chinese sovereignty regarding Taiwan?
Well, I think it's par for the course. What Angelo said about France and Macron, I think rings true, and I think Germany is a more extreme case because since the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, Germany has been nothing but subservient to whatever the United States has wanted in that conflict, no matter how much it has hurt Germany. Germany has really been the most affected by all of the sanctions and all of the escalations that have been occurring. But I think it just shows the hypocrisy, really, the hypocrisy of the collective West, because no matter how much they want to talk about Ukraine self-determination, countries like Germany never want to mention how the United States and NATO backed the coup. And that's because they're one of the biggest NATO partners. They were inherently involved in that coup in 2014 in Ukraine. And so it's just more hypocrisy. And I think this is really dangerous for Germany because China is Germany's largest trading partner. And if Germany is going to go the way it has gone with Russia, then, its status as an economic power and also just its stability itself, its political stability, is really at risk. And I think it is one of these cases, I think these historic cases that we're seeing now with all of Europe, which is just more and more shooting itself in the foot. That's really what it is. It's just more and more self-inflicted harm, really needless harm. But when you think about it, it's quite clear that these political operatives don't have any choices. Baerbock is just a political operative of the U.S. neocon and foreign policy establishment. Olaf Scholz is, no matter how moderate he is, he certainly also is more than willing to trade in whatever favor with the United States, regardless of the consequences.
Okay, I was just gonna ask Angelo. Well, I thought it was interesting, Danny. You talked about I was saying about how hypocritical it was for Germany to lecture China about Ukraine because the U.S. and also Europe are undermining Chinese sovereignty regarding Taiwan. But you brought up the fact that Ukraine hasn't had any sovereignty since 2014. The U.S. Overthrew the government and installed a client regime in its place. And since then, they have had no sovereignty. And so it's impossible for someone to violate sovereignty that does not actually exist. Angelo, Europe is, I think, also playing a role in undermining Chinese sovereignty regarding Taiwan. So they're lecturing China about Ukraine. What has the European Union, what have they been doing, or an individual European country, maybe France or Germany, what role have they played in encouraging what is essentially separatism on the island province of Taiwan?
Well, it's interesting that Germany, a country like Germany, is talking about sovereignty. Germany hasn't had any sovereignty since World War II. So you have it's still occupied. We know that there are, 30,000 US Army troops on the ground. And so the rule of the game were imposed, that their constitution was imposed by the US so they could control Germany. So what we saw in this war, since the Ukrainian war, was that actually you have European countries that actually have given up their sovereignty to the EU, which, by the way, the EU was a CIA-US project. It's really important to understand that. The first who was behind that was Jean Monnet and Walter Hallstein. They were CIA on the payroll of the CIA. And the idea was to dilute all the nation states and basically destruction of those nation states and to create a dictatorship in Brussels. a dictatorship, very similar to what you have in the US, thousands of lobbyists controlling politicians which, by the way, are not elected by European people. So what we saw here was that actually it highlighted that, and it highlighted that the EU is subservient to the US. So, and it's very interesting what we saw with Macron. Did you see Macron had planned this trip to China, and then von der Leyen, she insisted on joining. She insisted on joining, and which, it would be unthinkable if it was the goal, the EU. Actually, if the goal was still alive, France would have left the EU, because the goal didn't want that, The goal accepted to be in the EU just because France back then was even more powerful than Germany, because Germany was not united. So the goal accepted to be in the EU because he knew he could play a very strong role. So I think it is just ridiculous for those countries to talk about sovereignty. And you see the treatment they had. There was two different treatment, because China knows that the EU is an extension of the US. So you had two treatment. You had the treatment of von der Leyen and Macron. Von der Leyen, she had to go through the customs like average Joe, a huge humiliation. She had to take the train, like average Joe. It was not the treatment they did on Macron. And I think what China is maybe trying to do is maybe trying to divide. I mean, that's the only way it can win. They have to go this way. They will need to divide Europe. And maybe they're taking apart, maybe France. But they need one major country. Could be either France or Germany. If they have them on board, it changes completely. And you see how many shifts they've done so far. Shifts that we didn't believe could happen. We saw Turkey shifting. We saw India shifting. India, which is supposed to a China enemy, but somehow it's siding with the multipolar world. More shifts. With more shift, we might actually get to the tipping point. This tipping point where slowly, you have followers, and then everything overnight changes. And with the pain of Ukraine, as time passes by, we see that European countries they have only so much they can put into this, and people they don't want. If you ask Europeans, the mood is shifting. It was cool, at the beginning they thought, oh, it's attacked and so on. Now they're learning that they are financing Nazi regime, a drug addict, which is at the head of Ukraine, someone that doesn't care about Ukraine. So people are waking up.